Your poll has too many fill in the blank. Republicans, Democrats, cats, dogs. And that's why I don't believe it. This time on Poll Hub, a complaint that we get all the time, maybe not the one about the cats and the dogs, and the answer as to why we don't balance polls based on party. We're going to discuss that with Pew's Director of Survey Research, Courtney Kennedy. And then we're heading out to the Mountain West to check out a poll with a little problem. Literally. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll. You know, one of the more often asked questions and kind of perhaps derogatory comments we get from some of our fan mail is about whether we are biased because we have oversampled fill-in-the-blank Democrats or Republicans, depending upon
or
where
independents or
and it's not balanced. It doesn't all add up to the exact same number. So today we have Courtney Kennedy, Director of Survey Research at the Pew Research Center, to help us explain and talk about that very issue. Thanks for joining us, Courtney.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Courtney has co-authored an article with Scott Keeter, also from Pew Research, entitled Why Public Opinion Polls Don't Include the Same Number of Republicans and Democrats. So I'm going to ask the question, why don't we?
Well, because polls are not designed to sort of artificially level the playing field so that, there's equal views or equal numbers of interviews with all the subgroups in the population. Instead, what polls are designed to do is to look like the population, as if you were holding up a mirror. And if you held up a mirror to the country, you wouldn't necessarily see the same number of Republicans and Democrats. And indeed, there's a lot of data, not relying on polls, but other sources of data that suggest that distribution of the two major parties is not exactly equal. And so that's why we don't see them exactly equal in public opinion polls.
Okay, there's so much in here, Courtney, I wanted to sort of jump into. So the Democrats typically are more nationally. Talk a little bit about registration versus party identification, and why don't we just all, open up some book and find out what the registration is nationally and take it from there, because that's one of the things that were asked also.
Sure. Registration is definitely part of the conversation, but it is a different thing than if you were to go and ask somebody how they're feeling today in terms of which party they identify with. So you could speak with someone, and today they might say, you know what, I identify as Republican, but when they registered their party affiliation, with their Secretaries of State office or what have you, they could have registered as a Democrat, in the past, maybe 10, 20 years ago. And so for a lot of people, those two things line up, what they would tell you today if you asked and what's like sort of on their voter registration file. For a lot of people, that's the same, but certainly not for everybody. And, like Larry Sabadow and his colleagues have done a lot of good work good research demonstrating that point, looking at registration records. And so this really becomes clear if you look at some states in the South, like Kentucky, where historically it meant one thing to be a Democrat, right? And so you had a lot of people registered with the Democratic Party historically. But over time, Kentucky, has really become a red state. And so if you were to do that fresh ask, most people in Kentucky will say that they identify with the Republican Party. And, a lot of them have updated their registration to align with that, but some people still have not. And so that's why registration, which reflects the behavior that you did in the past, potentially quite a while ago, is not necessarily a perfect, indicator of how people are feeling today.
I mean, at the bottom of all this, it's worth noting, and our audience is pretty plugged into how polls work because that's what we've talked about for the last couple of years on here is some of the details of how we put together polls and the science behind it. I mean, the bottom line is that we don't wait for party ID. We don't wait for political party. We let the chips fall where they may. I'm wondering how much, though, of this concentration and focus on party has to do with what's happened with the parties, which is a lessening impact of them. And what I mean by that is there's fewer people who are identifying directly with parties. There's more independence over a 20-year period. And certainly there's a loss of kind of faith and trust in parties and other institutions. How much of what we're talking about in terms of people saying, hey, you don't have enough Democrats, you don't have enough Republicans in your party, has to do with this party kind of dissolving as a critical force in American politics?
Well, that's interesting. I think you touched on at least a couple live topics in terms of partisanship and polling. And so, as you say, if you do that initial ask of people, do you identify more as a Democrat or Republican, there's a significant share that sort of reject that and say neither party. I don't really like either of the two major parties. And there's tremendous evidence that the share of people who say that has increased over time. So that's absolutely true. At the same time, at Pew and a lot of other pollsters will ask a follow-up question of people that don't identify as to which party do you lean more to? And most people will actually answer that follow-up question. And we've looked at this really carefully, as have a lot of other political scientists. And our read is that if you look at the people who answer that follow-up question, and in the follow-up maybe they say that they are a Republican, the people who say they're Republican in the follow-up actually look a lot like people who said they were Republican to that first question. In other words, the quote-unquote leaners, the people that you catch in a follow-up question, really seem to fit the mold of people who identify with the party broadly.
So they identify, there's some kind of value to being an independent until you kind of push them one way or the other, and then we find out their true colors.
Well, I think also if you look at party not so much as one side or the other side, but as you're pointing out, Courtney, you're looking at it more as a continuum. You can see that when we do boil it down to just independents, that's not a whole heck of a lot of people. And so I think that's why this becomes such an issue when people are looking at polls, because of the fact that they feel that it matters depending upon how many of each party you have in the poll. They feel that this can certainly sway the results. And so I don't know what a good explanation or workaround is for that, other than that we, try really hard to make that difference. Are there other issues that we also deal with like this in polling? Because I think it gets at the idea of, we say we balance our survey, but why don't we balance our survey by party? I mean, even if you were going to have more Democrats and more Republicans in a particular place, what are some of the difficulties with using party, as a weighting factor?
Well, that's a great question, and as far as I can tell, views on that topic within the polling community have changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. And my colleagues are at a point where we honestly think, really good arguments can be made both ways. So to your question, perhaps the most compelling reason to not weight on party is that it is fundamentally an attitude that usually doesn't but can change, from one day to the next. There's a lot of research showing that party actually is pretty stable at the individual level, but it is an attitude. It's not like asking somebody about their age or gender or something that's really stable and is sort of more of a demographic characteristic. It is an attitude, and so there is a discomfort in taking your poll and really lining it up to what you claim to be, quote unquote target in the population. For something that's not really measured by the Census Bureau or some federal agency. It's going to be measured in some other source, and it's an attitude. So that means that there's greater uncertainty as to whether what you claim is the target actually is, and whether it's appropriate to sort of line up the survey data with that target. But I actually would say, again, there's a lot of debate on this, and it's really an issue when you think about online surveys, right? Because with online surveys, there's generally speaking even more modeling that the pollster has to do in order to try to get accurate representative results. And that includes very often having to, address this issue of partisanship in modeling. In the work that we've done with online samples, whether they're probability-based or not probability-based, they often will have a Democratic skew if you don't address that in weighting. And so I think if you're a pollster who's working with online samples, I would say it's actually best practice to address that in weighting. Otherwise, you could end up with some seriously biased estimates.
And so, what types of data would you use as targets in balancing an online sample?
Oh, that's a great question, and you see practice vary, and honestly, I think that the field lacks a really satisfying solution, given that we used to have a real wealth of gold standard public phone polls, and that to some extent is going away. So I think that I would have said used to be a wealth of where one could get those targets, whether it's the Gallup trend, or maybe some folks might look at Pew, or might look at Marist or Quinnipiac. To the extent that some of those polls are going away, it's hard to get those targets. But what I see done is pollsters looking within their own archive, right? So if you have a phone tracking poll or an online tracking poll, I've seen some pollsters look at what is our historical trend, and let's just make sure that our current poll isn't an outlier, but is kind of within the normal bounds, the normal balance that we tend to get on party. Yeah. But it's certainly an option to look at somebody else's polls, or maybe look at the National Election Survey, or the General Social Survey, something like that, to get a feel for what's a reasonable target too.
Yeah, because we have to be careful, because the future isn't always as we remember it. So that's always a tough thing in polling. You mentioned Kentucky, and actually in Kentucky, folks are really lucky because we can actually ask about party identification and get that attitude. But Kentucky also does have registration by party, so that provides a population parameter, at least, and a target, at least in that state, for us to be able to look at how people have answered the question.
And just to wrap up, I just you sort of were reading my mind, because I was going to ask you about your switching over to a panel from telephone surveying, and I do appreciate, just as someone who's doing the telephone surveying, that you indicated that a lot of this had to do with cost and time, not necessarily the inaccuracy that telephone polls were producing. So I thank you for that, and I understand also the incentive to move more in a panel direction. How have you generally assessed that switch? Because Pew is such a reputable organization, and when you made that switch, you made a lot of headlines. So how is that going right now for you guys?
It's going well. It has been, as you alluded to, a really major transition for us in almost every respect that you can imagine, from how we think about planning to cost to how we write questions, how we do analysis. I mean, almost everything has changed in some respect in moving from doing, cross-sectional telephone polls to working with a panel of people. And, we're fortunate here that we have the resources to have our own panel. And in the early days of our panel, we first stood it up in 2014. It was really more of a supplement to the workhorse that we were still doing a lot of phone polls, but that has switched in about the last 2 years, where we're now really doing almost exclusively with our online panel, and and phasing out phone. But we have ramped up the investment that we've made in our panel. So we doubled the size of our panel last summer, and we switched to an address-based recruitment. And at every step of the way, we've learned about things that work well and things that work less well. So it's very much a work in progress. But again, I'm really grateful that we've had the resources to do a lot of this stuff and to try to do it in a rigorous way.
And for the polling community, we thank you all that you're very transparent about all these things, so that we all can be learning as you are sort of taking us all down that path. So that's very, very helpful. And we want to thank you, Courtney Kennedy, Director of Survey Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Courtney. Appreciate it.
So we don't often delve into polls in states in the Intermountain West, other than maybe Colorado, because they're not generally in play. So two states we're going to talk about now are Montana and Wyoming, two beautiful states, but states that generally don't get a lot of attention from the national media because they're not generally super competitive, and there's generally not a lot of polling done in states like that too. But the university, Montana State University in Billings, does a poll. Has been doing polls since 1989, and a poll that they've done recently in both Montana and Wyoming has gotten a little bit of play in the national press, at least because there is a competitive Senate race in Wyoming, and because they asked some questions about Democrats running for president and who might be up and who might be down. All of it very interesting, but there's kind of a little problem here, the little one being
it is little.
Yeah,
it's little in the terms of the number of people that were actually interviewed, and I guess this is the issue that caught our attention. That in Montana and in Wyoming was the first time they've done added that to their repertoire. But when you boil down and got through all the numbers of the adults and the registered voters and the likely voters, you got down and you only had 40 Democrats in Montana and 14 in Wyoming.
And there are more than, just to be clear, there are more than 14 Democrats in Wyoming. We know that, right?
Not a lot more.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if anybody's actually counted that, but that was no small test.
But so here's my problem. For the Wyoming Democratic Presidential Caucus, they had among those 14 people who were likely to participate, Warren with 82%, undecided with 16%, Yang with 2%, Klobuchar with 1%, and Delaney less than 1%, which I guess means, I don't know, we had one person, I guess. But anyway, so that's the issue with this. You have a margin of error that's enormous. And so I think, and Barb, you want to talk to us, it's a great educational experience for students. But maybe not something that enlightens the political process about what's going on politically in those states. I guess that would be my take.
Let's step back too, because I think a lot of people often think when we do a sample of the country, which may be 800 or 900 or 1,000 people, a lot of people think that is also too small. How can we be talking about 200 million adults and only interview 1,000 people? And in probability theory, which we've talked a little bit about here, if you kind of mix the soup, which I know you like to do, Lee, you mix the pot of soup and take a sample of it, you can get a good sense.
I don't like actually to mixing soup. I like to use the metaphor for sampling.
Okay, well, I've seen you at least in an animated character on our academy mixing soup.
Yes.
But you're able to get a random selection of what's in that soup or what's in that population. Mm-hmm. But what statistics does tell us is that you do have to reach at least a certain level or a certain number of people that you are interviewing in order to draw some conclusions.
So let me ask, because I think you raise a good point. We talk to 1,000 people and we say that is representative of what 200 million people think. There are only 500,000 people in Wyoming. So as a percentage of the population, there are 177 people they talk to in Wyoming is actually a higher percentage of the population than we talk to of Americans. So how come that's not valid?
Because in probability theory, it's not the proportion of people that you speak with.
It's a threshold.
You have to reach a particular threshold. So believe it or not, whether you're doing Marist College, whether you're doing New York State, Wyoming, Montana, or the country, it's pretty much the same threshold that you have to reach
Which
in
is
order to draw a conclusion.
850.
Depending on what you want, your requirements is a margin of error. And then if you want to look at subgroups, well, then you better
gotta be
interview
more, right.
even more. So getting down in this particular poll to likely Democratic or likely Republican voters really even makes it a little bit more. I mean, some have suggested do this as a learning experience. It's fine. But when it hits the public, maybe that's not a good place for this.
So journalists should know better than to probably report on numbers like this when the sample size is so small.
And there's lots of lessons for the students to learn in this. For instance, look at the American Association of Public Opinion Research Transparency Initiative, and in putting together their methodology, they would see guidelines for all the things that they should include. Other polling organizations that are doing public polling also have a minimum for the group that they're going to be talking about, so the number of people in that group. For us, it's 100. We want to make sure that there's at least 100 people that we interviewed if we're going to talk about a particular group.
Out of the whole pool, not
right.
100
So
total.
if we're going to talk about Democrats or Republicans, if we're going to talk about men or women, people who are white or non-white, we want to make sure that there's at least 100 people that we have interviewed to find out their opinions.
And when we do that, the margin of error is much higher than it is for the poll because there's fewer people, and we put that out there.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. Well, this is a good opportunity to plug something that we do here that you probably know about, because we've been talking about the Poll Hub Academy. And all of the stuff that we just talked about here, and actually the stuff we were talking about with Courtney, is covered in the Academy. So the Poll Hub Academy is free. It's online. It's a visual and immersive series of courses. We do it for you guys so that you can learn more about polling. So if you want to do that, go to academy.marispoll.maris.edu. We'll also put it in the show notes. Again, it's free. Hey, what's not to like about free?
Okay, and you are done with the plug, so that does it for this edition of Poll Hub. Before we let you go, I'm not going to say that. You just said that. But I will say that Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our patient executive producer, and Casey Schaff is our very patient editor.
And as always, we also want to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades.
And you can reach out to us on social media, ask your questions there. Do it on Facebook, on Twitter at Marist Poll, Instagram, and as we always like to say, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. If you like what you hear, the more reviews you leave, the better it is for people who are searching for new podcasts to listen to on their lengthy commutes on the freeways of the U.S. See you next time.